everyone, this is Elizabeth O'Connor from Washington College, and this is my talk, Pamela Colman Smith's Connections Between Irish Myth and Afro-Jamaican Anansi Tales. Today, Pamela Colman Smith is primarily remembered for designing a tarot deck, which has been known for most of the last 110 years as a Rider-Waite deck. Its name commemorates two men, the mystic A.E. Waite, who is credited with conceiving the deck, and the London publisher William Rider, rather than the actual designer of the cards. This omission encapsulates Colman Smith's gendered erasure from the cultural imagination, a type of misogyny that affected many women artists and writers at the turn of the 20th century. My book, Pamela Colman Smith, Feminist Artist and Mystic, which will be out this May, contends that Colman Smith was much more than the graphic designer of the storied 1909 tarot deck that served as the model for T.S. Eliot's Madame Sosostris and her wicked pack of cards in the Wasteland. Active from the mid-1890s through the 1920s, Colman Smith had a burgeoning career as an artist, writer, folklore performer, editor, publisher, stage designer, and suffrage activist. Her paintings were exhibited at a range of galleries in the US and England, including several major international art exhibitions. She also had the distinction of being the first non-photographic artist, beating out Rodin, to have her work shown at Alfred Stieglitz's 291 Gallery in Manhattan. Prolific, Colman Smith illustrated over 20 books and pamphlets, wrote two collections of Afro-Jamaican Anansi folktales, and co-edited a broadsheet with Jack Yates from 1902 to 1903. Forging her own path, she created and edited The Green Sheaf from 1903 to 1904 by herself, and after its demise, ran the Green Sheaf Press, which focused particularly on women writers. She was actively involved in the women's suffrage movement, creating multiple posters and postcards and helping working-class women attend suffrage rallies. In addition, she was arrested for suffrage activities at least once. And her letters to friends, patrons, publishers, and gallery owners reveal an impressible spirit who is committed to rooting out all types of hypocrisy and prejudice, including classism, sexism, and racism, but who nonetheless capitalized on racial stereotypes through her Afro-Jamaican Anansi performances. Taken as a whole, Colman Smith's prodigious body of work is particularly notable for both its hybridity and its ability to take on, and often as quickly cast aside, a range of personas and identity. And this is a photograph of Colman Smith by Gertrude Cassibier. Identity and belonging, or lack thereof, are central to both Colman Smith's work and life as a perceived biracial, gender non-conforming person. She was born in London to wealthy white American expatriate parents on February 16, 1878. Colman Smith's racial identity is uncertain, but her parents lived as white, and so did she. However, throughout her life, she was consistently viewed as an other, with contemporaries describing her as Asian, Black, or even an indeterminate creature. Given her well-documented dark skin, it seems highly likely that Colman Smith was biracial, but I found no direct evidence to support this throughout my archival research. In the absence of such confirmation, I concentrate on how friends, critics, and audiences viewed her and how she capitalized on others' perceptions of her as biracial through her Afro-Jamaican Anansi performances. Colman Smith also deviated from accepted norms regarding her gender identity and sexuality. She never married nor had children, and instead developed close relationships with women. Nicknamed Pixie by Ellen Terry, Colman Smith embraced the appellation, constructing a gender indeterminate persona that persisted into her work. Although Colman Smith spent her early childhood in England, she lived in Jamaica for about 7 years. During her late childhood and adolescence, she studied at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn as a teenager, but returning to England in the spring of 1900 to make her primary residence. While letters reveal she was close to her parents, especially her father, Both parents died before she was 22. Shortly thereafter, Colman Smith wrote to an acquaintance, "I've been on a good many long voyages, 25, beginning when I was 3 months old. A peripatetic childhood exposed her to multiple cultures and laid the groundwork for her eclectic bricolage, contributing to the retreat into imaginative worlds and perpetual quest for belonging that infuses much of her work." During the approximately 30 years During the approximately 30 years she was most active, Colman Smith was involved in a wide range of groups that reflect both her disparate interests and the changes in her art over her career. When she was emerging as an artist in the 1890s, her chief influences were Arthur Wesley Dow, her teacher at the Pratt Institute, and Howard Pyle, a prominent American illustrator whose books she loved and with whom she attempted to study, as well as William Morris, Kate Greenaway, Walter Crane, and the British arts and crafts movement more broadly. During this period, Colman Smith also made important connections with the growing New York City-based community of women artists, including Ida Haskell, Gertrude Cassibier, and Catherine Pyle. In 1899, she first met the British actor Ellen Terry, who was to become a longtime friend and benefactor. After leaving the U.S. with Terry in the spring of 1900, Colman Smith toured with the Lyceum Theater Company, making many drawings of Terry and her partner, Henry Irving, as well as forging a friendship with the company's manager, Bram Stoker. She collaborated on several projects with all of them in the ensuing years and even performed for King Edward VII in 1904. Colman Smith's web of influence was unusually wide. She contributed in multiple media to disparate networks in London, Dublin, and New York, as well as some brief forays into the continent. Through Terry, Colman Smith was also introduced to Terry's children, Edith Craig and Edward Gordon Craig, both of whom would become important friends and collaborators. Her interest in Irish myth led her to W.B. Yeats and his family, who in turn introduced her to Lady Augusta Gregory, George Russell, A.E., and John Millington Synge, as well as other members of the Irish literary revival, many of whom contributed to her little magazine, The Green Sheaf. Through her friendship with Yeats, Colman Smith joined his experimental group of maskers and met Florence Farr. She was initiated in 1901 into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, of which Yeats and Farr were also members. It was through this community, with which she was associated for about a decade, that she met A.E. Waite, her future collaborator on the Tarot deck. Colman Smith widely exhibited her music pictures, works of art inspired by synesthetic vision she experienced while listening to a range of orchestral music from Bach to Debussy in England, continental Europe, and the United States. This led to 3 exhibitions at Alfred Stiglitz's Experimental 291 Gallery in New York between 1907 and 1909, as well as her friendship with Debussy. Throughout her life, Colman Smith consistently encountered friends, acquaintances, and critics who did not understand her and who had a hard time positioning her within existing gender, class, and racial categories. John Yates, William Butler Yeats's father, made this assessment in the summer of 1899 after meeting Colman Smith to discuss her proposal to illustrate a collection of Gaelic mythology for children that would be written by W.B. Yeats, a venture that never materialized. Pamela Smith and her father are the funniest looking people, the most primitive Americans possible, but I like them much. Her work, whether a drawing or the telling of a piece of folklore, is very direct and original and therefore sincere, its originality being its naivete. I should feel safe in getting her to illustrate anything. She looks exactly like a Japanese. Nanny says this Japanese appearance comes from constantly drinking iced water. You at first think her rather elderly. You are surprised to find out that she is very young, quite a girl. I don't think there is anything great profound in her, or very emotional or practical. At the time of her visit with Yeats, the rather elderly Colman Smith was just 21. John Yeats's comments reflect the conflation of the directness, originality, and sincerity of her art with the perceived naivete which was to occur repeatedly in discussions of her art. Moreover, his appraisal reflects both his paternalism and his biases against primitive Americans, especially those whom he assumed to be a class below him and whose racial origins he had trouble ascertaining. And these types of assessments, like the one of John Yates, were to appear over and over again by people Colman Smith encountered. I discuss them more fully in my book. I'm happy to take questions about more of them, but for time constraints, I'm going to keep going and talk about her connection to Irish myth. So after leaving the Pratt Institute, one of the first professional pieces Colman Smith produced was a 5-print portfolio that was published by R.H. Russell in December of 1898. It included a triptych based on Yeats's 1894 play, The Land of Heart's Desire. In this piece, Colman Smith deviates from her more conventional use of white to emphasize purity and innocence, and instead employs the color to highlight the ethereality and unconventional nature of both the female sprites and the human women they seduce. Overall, the piece is notable for the extreme movement of its riotously dancing female fairies who cavort on the 2 side panels. In the center image, Sean Brown attempts to restrain his wife Marie from leaving with the barefoot, red-headed fairy child who leads the dancing white-gowned sprites. In the background, Sean's parents, Mortine and Bridget, physically restrain the priest, Father Hart, from intervening, as even the representative of the church is powerless in the presence of the fairies, whom the play asserts are the offspring of Satan. The fairy child tempts Marie, telling her that if she stays with her husband, her life will be filled with hard work and frequent childbirth. But in fairyland, all would be different. Colman Smith's excerpts that are included under the triptych emphasize both the freedom and agelessness of the fairies, as well as the lure of fairyland, a place where, quote, nobody gets old and crafty and wise, where nobody gets old and godly and grave, where nobody gets old and bitter of tongue. It sounds like just the type of place Colman Smith herself would enjoy. However, what her triptych, with its focus on the dancing fairies and the restrained wife, elides is that once Marie decides to follow the fairy child, she dies. After death, Marie transforms into a little bird with crest of gold, who then escapes to a land where even the old are fair, and even the wise are merry of tongue. This bird, without explanation, is included in the bottom of the triptych. The Land of Heart's Desire was important work for Colman Smith. It was likely her first introduction to both Yeats's work and Irish myth, as well as the sprites more commonly known as pixies. Colman Smith even performed the role of the fairy child in 2 London productions in 1904. Pixies was to become an important symbol and identity for her in the early decades of the 1900s. Furthermore, the play marks the first time Yeats drew on Irish folklore as living mythology. As Bridget Bramsbach notes, Yeats himself was firmly convinced that folklore in all its manifestations was a living force, a power which should be used to vitalize literature. This paper highlights how this idea of a vibrant, dynamic mythology greatly influenced Colman Smith and resonated with her own growing interest in Afro-Jamaican Anansi tales. The history and lore of very different traditions were extremely important to Colman Smith and are often fused in her work from the fin de siècle period. Colman Smith's 1899 Anansi tales, hold on one second, reflected her interest in cross-cultural representations between Afro-Jamaican Anansi stories and European myths, especially those from Ireland. Her illustrations for Anansi stories bear several similarities to both the female dancing figures in her triptych of Yeats's The Land of Heart's Desire and her drawing for Seamus McManus's In Chimney Corners Merry Tales of Irish Folklore, which were all published within a year of each other. This suggests that Colman Smith was beginning to create a transcultural representational code. For example, her illustration of 3 sisters seemingly bewitched by Anansi's fiddling and how Anansi win the 5 doubloons is similar to the riotous dancers in her illustration for Yeats's play. Both groups of figures are consumed by the otherworldly magic of music. In Yeats's play, the sprites seduce the young woman into going with them to fairyland, leading to her death, but this decision is presented as part of her avoidance of responsibility as a wife and mother. In Colman Smith's story, the wily Anansi gains access to a previously off-limits house and the mistress's 3 daughters through his fiddling outside their door. Entranced by the music, the girls beg their mother to allow him inside, which she begrudgingly does. And then he come in and play and dance and had a very nice time. And then they had a grand supper and they dance all night till before day. The riotous merriment sparked by Anansi's magical music allows him to transgress racial divisions and results in him earning the 5 doubloons of the story's title from his friends who had bet him that he would never gain entrance. Colman Smith's moral: this story showed that there is nothing that a man can't do if he try, emphasizes that persistence does pay off. Throughout Anansi's stories and in Chimney Corners, there are some marked similarities but also key differences in Colman Smith's depiction of white characters, especially women. In both collections, the influence of the pre-Raphaelites is evident. Colman Smith's women tend to be tall, often as tall or taller than their male counterparts, and wear long, flowing dresses, often ornately patterned with flowers in their hair. However, in Anansi's stories, Colman Smith's white women are very static and are generally depicted in profile as they stare mistily into the distance. This is in direct contrast to the active poses and animated expressions of both the animals and the Afro-Jamaicans of both sexes that pepper the text, and likely reflects racial and gender stereotypes surrounding the deportment of white women in the fin de siècle. While the white women in Chimney Corners often wear similar clothes to their Anansi stories counterparts, their stances are much more active and their facial features more animated, making them much more similar to the female dancing figures in How Anansi Win the 5 Doubloons and the triptych creates as The Land of Heart's Desire. One interesting exception is Colman Smith's depiction of the hen wife in Billy Beg and the Bull. In Chimney Corners, shown sitting on a bench surrounded by her fowl, the hen wife is hunched over with much darker skin than the other women. Her red-rimmed eyes are closed, and she is dressed in black to highlight her otherness in comparison to the king's brightly clothed daughter who seeks her help. Like the Obeah women and other magical figures found in Anansi stories, the hen wife is a figure of magic and mystery, and as such, her depiction is much closer to those figures than Colman Smith's portrayal of other white women in either text. The clearest example of Colman Smith's transcultural representational code can be found in her drawings of Anansi and of the Irish giant that features on the cover and frontispiece of In Chimney Corners. Interestingly, the giant only appears as a central character in the final story of the collection, the giant of the Band Beggars Hall, and is not physically described other than the repeated refrain that he is the greatest giant over all of them. In fact, the giant shown calling a flock of birds in the volume's frontispiece is actually the brother of the titular giant. Colman Smith's drawing of both Anansi and the giant include larger ears, upturned eyes, sloping brows, and flyaway hair to indicate that despite their culturally specific differences, she saw both of these characters as trickster figures. Although his physical strength far surpasses that of the diminutive Anansi, the giant loves to engage in trickery and is only narrowly bested by Jack, the King of Ireland's son. Jack, the story's main protagonist, embodies a 21st century definition of toxic masculinity. Spoiled and petulant, he kicks a harmless cat and terrifies his mother, the queen, in his anger. He only meets the giant and is tricked into his quest after becoming enraged that a bridge he commanded his father to build, because the trout in the stream are wagging their tails at him, has been repeatedly destroyed. It is not clear whether the decision to put the giant on the cover and frontispiece of the collection, rather than the more obvious Jack, who is the protagonist of several of the tales and the closest to a unifying figure, was made by Colman Smith, or the author Seamus McManus, the publisher, or some combination thereof. A much smaller male figure, probably Jack, appears in the center bottom of the frontispiece, but rather than aggressively confronting the giant, as Jack does in the story, he stares up at him with amazed, upturned eyes. While Jack could be showing his appreciation toward the giant for the gifts he receives after locating his secret castle, it is equally plausible that Colman Smith is subtly mocking Jack and trying to reorient the collection away from him and toward the giant, whom she views as a more interesting trickster figure. Unfortunately, no known correspondence between Colman Smith and McManus exists that could shed light on these illustrative choices or even how Colman Smith became acquainted with McManus and obtained the job. In the late 1890s, McManus, who was married to the Irish literary revival poet Ethna Carberry, was at the beginning of his literary career. However, he would quickly gain a wide following in the U.S. for his retellings of Irish folklore. Although he had lived in New York in the 1890s, where he published his first two collections and possibly met Colman Smith, McManus returned to his native Ireland in the spring of 1899 and resumed work as a school teacher, as prepared in Chimney Corners for publication. Colman Smith notes in an August 1899 letter to a friend that she and her father had traveled to Mount Charles, a village in Donegal, to see McManus and were not impressed. Quote, "He is a bloomin' schoolmaster and awful stupid," unquote. Colman Smith does not elaborate on what provoked this evaluation, but it's fascinating to speculate that some of her negative opinion might have been due to a disagreement over their varying approaches to the folklore collection, especially the decision to place the giant on the cover and the frontispiece. Even more importantly, it was during this first visit to Ireland in the summer of 1899, quote, that the power to see clearly the invisible realm, which Colman Smith claims to have possessed in early childhood, returned to her. Through these visions, by reading a wide variety of Irish myths and legend, Colman Smith became well versed in Irish mythology, learning to distinguish between the, quote, gnomes, goblins, wraiths, leprechauns, pixies, salamanders, and people of the sea. These visions helped her to develop both her pixie persona and her close friendship with W.B. Yeats, which resulted in her quickly becoming a member of his maskers. This involvement seems to have been a direct catalyst in Colman Smith's decision to start giving public performances of the Anansi tales she had been delivering at home to friends and acquaintances for several years. And so after she returned to England and was introduced to first W.B. Yeats and then his siblings, she started co-editing a broadsheet with Jack Yeats throughout 1902 and 1903. And you can see here her illustration for A.E.'s The Gates of Dreamland. On this, this is the July 1902 issue that combines Jack Yeats's illustration for Sligo Ballad Singers with Colman Smith's illustration for A Cobweb Cloak of Time that's associated with a poem of hers, and Pirate Ships in the Distance. After the two of them ceased collaborating, she, with help from W.B. Yeats, launched her Green Sheaf in the spring of 1903, which ran for 13 issues, and it included a bunch of members of the Irish Literary Revival. Here is Colman Smith's illustration for Lady Gregory's translation of The Hill of Heart's Desire. This is a illustration by A.E. entitled A Million Years Hence. She also included Sings the Dream of Inishmaan, which was published in the second issue of the Green Sheaf. Colman Smith continued to be friendly with Yeats and members of his family during the 1910s. At right is a sketch that John Yeats made of Colman Smith in 1907. And then above is a sketch that Colman Smith made of W.B. Yeats in 1904. Gradually, she began to move in different orbits, and especially after her 1919 move to Cornwall, she ceased to have a lot of connection with either W.B. Yeats or other members of his family. I'm happy to take any other questions that you may have, especially in relationship to the Green Sheaf and a broadsheet that I kind of only touched on here. Take care.